Wichita had always believed in its own calm. It was a city built on routine, where mornings began with the sound of sprinklers clicking on and the smell of coffee drifting from open kitchen windows. People trusted their streets. Doors were often left unlocked during the day, and neighbors knew each other by name. There was nothing about Wichita that suggested it would become the center of a nightmare that would last for decades. That belief shattered on a cold winter morning. Snow clung to the edges of sidewalks, and the air carried a sharp stillness that made every sound feel louder. When police cars pulled up in front of a modest family home, flashing red and blue against the pale sky, no one understood what was happening. At first, neighbors assumed there had been an accident. Maybe a gas leak. Maybe a medical emergency. No one imagined what officers were about to discover inside. The house looked normal from the outside. Curtains drawn, lights off, nothing broken or forced. But inside, the silence was heavy and wrong. Officers moved carefully from room to room, their boots echoing softly on the floor. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A family lay dead, bound and killed with a cruelty that felt deliberate and controlled. There was no sign of a struggle loud enough for neighbors to hear. No clues left behind that made sense. It was as if the killer had planned every detail and then vanished into thin air. Word spread quickly, but details were scarce. Police sealed off the area, and reporters gathered behind yellow tape, whispering rumors into microphones. By afternoon, fear had already begun to replace disbelief. Parents picked up their children early from school. Store owners locked their doors sooner than usual. People stood in small groups, talking in low voices, trying to understand how something so terrible could happen in a place that felt so safe. Police worked through the night, searching for anything that could explain the crime. They looked for fingerprints, footprints, fibers, anything out of place. But the house seemed almost too clean. The killer had not rushed. He had not panicked. He had taken his time. That realization scared investigators more than anything else. Days passed with no arrest. Then, just as the city began to drown in questions, a letter arrived at a local newspaper. It was plain, typed on ordinary paper, with no return address. At first, editors thought it might be a cruel prank. But as they read on, their hands began to shake. The letter described the crime in detail. Not the kind of details that could be guessed or copied from news reports. These were private facts known only to the police and the killer. The writer did not sound angry or rushed. The tone was calm, almost proud. He explained what he had done as if it were a project carefully completed. At the bottom of the page was a name, written clearly for all to see. BTK. Bind. Torture. Kill. The police were notified immediately. Officers stared at the letter in disbelief. Killers sometimes contacted the media, but this felt different. This person was not asking for forgiveness or attention through chaos. He was introducing himself, claiming ownership, declaring that this was not a one-time act. When the newspaper reported the letter, panic spread like fire. The name BTK became a whisper passed from house to house, then a shout on the evening news. People locked their doors at night and checked them twice. Windows were shut and curtains pulled tight. Parents lay awake listening for sounds that did not belong. The police formed a special task force, bringing together detectives, analysts, and anyone with experience in violent crimes. They studied the letter again and again, hoping to find something, anything, that would point them in the right direction. They looked at the wording, the spelling, the structure. They wondered about the person behind the page. Was he educated? Was he local? Was he watching them right now? Then, before answers could be found, BTK struck again. This time, the city was ready to be afraid, but not ready enough. Another home, another quiet street, another family shattered. The method was similar, but not identical. It was as if the killer wanted to show that he could change his approach whenever he wanted. He was not following rules. He was making them. At the scene, police found a strange symbol left behind. It meant nothing at first glance, but it felt intentional, like a signature. BTK wanted to be known. He wanted his work recognized. The idea that he was nearby, watching the response to his crimes, sent a chill through the entire city. Community meetings were held in school gyms and churches. Police officers stood at the front, offering safety tips and reassurance, but their words sounded thin against the growing fear. How do you protect yourself from someone who leaves no trace and chooses victims without warning? How do you sleep when the enemy could be anyone? People began to look at each other differently. Strangers felt suspicious. Even familiar faces carried a new weight. A neighbor who kept to himself. A man who walked alone at night. Small details that once meant nothing now felt threatening. BTK sent more letters. Some were angry, accusing the media of ignoring him. Others were mocking, criticizing the police for being too slow or too stupid to catch him. Each letter proved the same thing. He was still free. And he was enjoying the game. Investigators chased every lead. They questioned hundreds of people. They followed tips that led nowhere. Each failure added pressure. Each new crime felt like a personal defeat. The killer was always one step ahead, or so it seemed. Behind closed doors, detectives began to fear that this case would never be solved. They worried that BTK would keep killing, that the city would never feel safe again. But they kept working, driven by the faces of the victims and the promise that this man would not win forever. As the weeks turned into months, Wichita changed. The innocence that once defined it faded. People learned to live with fear, to carry it quietly as part of daily life. The name BTK became a symbol of everything that had been lost. And somewhere in the city, hidden among ordinary lives and routines, the killer watched it all unfold. The fear that settled over Wichita did not fade after the first murders. Instead, it grew heavier with time, sinking into everyday life until it felt normal to carry. People learned to live with locked doors and darkened streets, but peace never truly returned. Every few weeks, another reminder arrived, and each one came in the form of a letter. BTK continued to write. His messages were sent to newspapers, television stations, and sometimes directly to the police. Each letter carried the same cold confidence. He spoke as if he were in control, as if the city belonged to him. He corrected reporters when they made mistakes about his crimes. He complained when his name was not mentioned enough. He wanted attention, and he wanted respect. Investigators began to understand that this killer was driven by more than violence. He needed to be recognized. The crimes were not enough on their own. The fear, the headlines, the whispers were just as important. BTK was not hiding because he was afraid. He was hiding because it gave him power. Police studied the letters obsessively. They enlarged photocopies, circled words, underlined phrases. Every misspelling, every unusual expression was treated like a possible clue. Experts were brought in to analyze his language. They debated his age, his education, his background. Some believed he was young and reckless. Others thought he was older, more disciplined. The truth stayed just out of reach. As the investigation dragged on, BTK continued to kill, but never in a predictable way. His victims were different ages, from different neighborhoods, living different lives. There was no single pattern that could explain his choices. This randomness made him even more terrifying. Anyone could be next. Police presence increased across the city. Patrol cars cruised slowly through quiet streets at night. Officers knocked on doors, asking questions, handing out safety advice. Community watch programs formed overnight. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now shared phone numbers and watched each other's homes. Still, the killer slipped through every net. Then, without warning, the letters stopped. At first, investigators believed it was a trick. They waited for another message, another taunt, another crime. But weeks passed, then months. Nothing happened. No letters. No new murders linked to BTK. The city held its breath, afraid to hope. As time moved on, theories began to form. Some thought BTK had been arrested for another crime under a different name. Others believed he had died or moved away. A few feared something worse, that he was simply waiting, planning something even more terrible. The uncertainty was its own kind of torture. Inside the police department, frustration grew. The case files became thicker, filled with reports, photos, and unanswered questions. Detectives rotated in and out of the task force as years passed. New officers studied the case with fresh eyes, then slowly realized how little there was to hold on to. The killer had left almost nothing behind. Technology offered little help at the time. DNA testing was still limited and unreliable. The samples collected from crime scenes were small and degraded. Computers were primitive, unable to store or analyze information the way they would decades later. Investigators were fighting a modern monster with outdated tools. For the public, life slowly resumed its shape. Children grew up. Businesses opened and closed. New families moved into old neighborhoods, unaware of the history written into the walls. The name BTK faded from headlines, then from memory. For many, that felt like relief. But for BTK, being forgotten was unbearable. Unseen by everyone else, he continued to live his life. He worked a steady job. He paid his bills. He smiled at people who had no idea who he really was. He watched the news, waiting for his name to appear. When it didn't, anger burned quietly inside him. He kept souvenirs from his crimes, reminders of what he had done and what he believed he deserved credit for. He replayed his memories again and again, reliving the fear he had caused. To him, the silence was not a victory for the police. It was an insult. Years turned into decades. Investigators retired. Victims' families learned to live with unanswered questions. Some moved away. Some stayed, holding on to the hope that one day the truth would come out. The case became one of the city's darkest legends, a story told in hushed tones. Behind the scenes, the police never completely let go. The files were revisited from time to time. New technologies brought brief waves of excitement, but nothing ever stuck. BTK remained a ghost, a name without a face. Then, almost 30 years after the nightmare began, something changed. A package arrived at a local television station. Inside was a letter. The tone was instantly familiar. Calm, confident, cruel. BTK had returned. The city froze. Old fears rushed back as if no time had passed at all. For younger residents, the name was just a story they had heard. For older ones, it was a wound reopened. The police reacted faster this time. They recognized the danger immediately. The letter made it clear that BTK was angry. He accused the media of ignoring him. He complained that newer criminals were getting more attention. He wanted the world to remember what he had done. More importantly, he wanted to prove that he was still smarter than everyone else. This time, investigators were ready. They treated every word like a weapon that could be turned against him. Unlike before, technology was now on their side. Computers could analyze language patterns. DNA databases had grown. Digital forensics could uncover hidden details invisible to the human eye. BTK continued to communicate, believing he was still in control. He asked questions, almost playfully, as if testing the police. He wanted reassurance that he could still speak without being caught. And in their public responses, police gave him exactly what he wanted to hear. They lied. When BTK asked if certain technology could trace him, police said no. They encouraged him to keep talking, to keep sending messages, to keep making the same mistakes killers always make when their pride grows too large. BTK believed them. He did not realize that the game had changed, that every message brought him closer to the end of the freedom he had enjoyed for so long. His need to be seen, to be remembered, was pulling him out of the shadows. The ghost who had terrified a city for decades was no longer content to hide. And in wanting the spotlight once more, he was about to reveal himself. For almost 30 years, BTK existed only as a memory, a name spoken softly when old fears resurfaced. To many in Wichita, he had become a story from another time, something that belonged to a darker past. New generations grew up without knowing the constant tension their parents once lived with. The city had changed, grown larger, busier, louder. Yet beneath the progress, the shadow never fully disappeared. Then one morning, that shadow stepped back into the light. It began quietly, the way it always did. A package arrived at a local television station, unremarkable on the outside. No alarms were raised at first. It sat among other mail, waiting to be opened. When staff finally did, a familiar chill ran through the room. The letter inside felt like it came from the past, as if time itself had folded inward. The tone was unmistakable. Calm. Controlled. Proud. The writer spoke as if no years had passed at all. He referenced old crimes with confidence and corrected small details, proving he still knew the case better than anyone else. At the bottom, he signed his name, BTK. Within hours, the news spread. Wichita froze. The fear people thought they had buried rushed back to the surface. Older residents felt their hearts sink, remembering sleepless nights and locked doors. Younger ones struggled to understand how a killer from decades ago could suddenly return. Police reacted instantly. This was no longer the same department that had chased BTK years earlier. Technology had changed everything. Computers were faster. Databases were larger. Forensic science had evolved. The killer might believe he was facing the same enemies, but the game was different now. Investigators reopened old files, pulling boxes from storage, spreading photographs and reports across long tables. They compared the new letter to the old ones, analyzing the language, the spacing, the phrasing. The similarities were undeniable. This was the same voice, the same mind. BTK was not pretending. He was back. What unsettled detectives most was the timing. Why now? Why after so many years of silence? The answer soon became clear. BTK was angry. In his letter, he complained about being forgotten. Other killers had taken his place in the headlines. His story was fading, and he could not accept that. He began sending more messages. Some were directed at the media, demanding coverage. Others were addressed to the police, filled with challenges and questions. He spoke as if he was still in control, as if he were teaching them a lesson. Investigators decided to use that arrogance against him. They responded publicly, careful with every word. When BTK asked whether certain forms of technology could track him, police answered calmly, assuring him that he was safe. They knew he was testing them, looking for reassurance. And they gave it to him. Behind the scenes, every message was being torn apart by experts. Digital forensic teams examined metadata. Linguists studied sentence patterns. Behavioral analysts looked for changes in tone that might suggest age or stress. BTK believed he was playing the same game as before, but now every move he made left a trail. As the correspondence continued, the killer grew more confident. He spoke about future plans, about puzzles and clues he wanted to share. He wanted interaction. He wanted to feel powerful again. Each letter carried not just threats, but a deep hunger for acknowledgement. Then came the moment that would change everything. In one of his messages, BTK asked a simple question. He wanted to know if a floppy disk could be traced back to him. The question itself revealed something important. He was thinking about sending more than words. He was thinking about using technology he believed was outdated and safe. Police seized the opportunity. They responded publicly, saying that a floppy disk could not be traced. They made it sound official, confident, final. To BTK, it felt like confirmation that he was still smarter than them all. Not long after, a package arrived. Inside was a floppy disk. To BTK, it was just another way to communicate, another step in his game. To investigators, it was a gift. They handled it carefully, aware that this could be the break they had waited decades for. When forensic experts examined the disk, they found hidden information. Not just the text BTK wanted them to read, but data he did not know he was sharing. A document name, a user account, a digital fingerprint that pointed somewhere real. The trail led to a church. At first, the connection seemed impossible. A place of worship did not fit the image of the monster they were hunting. But the data did not lie. Investigators dug deeper, checking computers at the church, reviewing access logs. One name appeared again and again. Slowly, carefully, police began to build a profile around that name. It belonged to a man who lived an ordinary life. He worked a steady job. He attended church. He had a family. There was nothing about him that screamed danger. And yet, the pieces were starting to fit. Surveillance began quietly. Officers watched from a distance, noting routines, habits, movements. They compared old timelines to his past. They looked for overlaps, moments where his life intersected with the murder's. The more they searched, the more connections appeared. Still, they needed proof. The most important evidence lay in DNA collected from old crime scenes. For years, it had been useless, too degraded to analyze properly. But technology had improved. Scientists believed they could finally get a clear result. Investigators obtained a DNA sample from the suspect, careful to follow every legal step. The waiting that followed was unbearable. Decades of fear, failure, and frustration hung in the balance. When the results came back, there was no doubt. The DNA matched. After 30 years, the ghost had a name, a face, and an address. Police prepared for the arrest with extreme caution. They knew this man had lived a double life for decades. They did not know how he would react when confronted. They did not know if he might try to run, or worse. When officers finally approached him, it was in broad daylight. He was going about his normal routine, unaware that his carefully built world was about to collapse. When they told him he was under arrest and mentioned the name BTK, something changed in his expression. The mask slipped, just for a moment. At the station, the man who had once terrified an entire city sat quietly. He did not shout. He did not deny it. In fact, he seemed relieved, as if the weight of secrecy had finally become too heavy to carry. As news of the arrest spread, Wichita held its breath. People struggled to believe it was real. After all those years, after all the fear and unanswered questions, the killer was finally caught. But the story was far from over. The return of BTK had brought answers, but it had also reopened wounds. The city would soon learn just how close evil had lived among them, and how a killer's need for attention had finally led to his downfall. The arrest did not happen in the dead of night or after a dramatic chase. It happened under an ordinary sky, during an ordinary day, in a place where nothing extraordinary was supposed to occur. That was what made it so unsettling. The man police approached looked like countless others in Wichita. He wore plain clothes. He moved with calm familiarity through his routine. If anyone had passed by at that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual at all. When officers spoke his name and told him he was under arrest, he seemed confused for a brief second. Then they said 3 letters that had haunted the city for decades. BTK. At that moment, something changed behind his eyes. The confusion vanished. In its place was recognition. Not fear. Not panic. Recognition. He did not resist as they placed him in handcuffs. His body stayed relaxed, almost cooperative. The killer who had once controlled every moment of terror now allowed himself to be led away without a struggle. For the officers, that calm was chilling. It felt as though he had been waiting for this moment. At the police station, he sat alone in a small room under harsh lights. The walls were bare. There was no audience, no cameras, no letters to write, just silence. For years, he had been the one watching from the shadows. Now, he was the one being observed. Detectives entered slowly. They did not rush. They knew this man valued control more than anything else, and they would not give it to him easily. They laid out evidence piece by piece. The letters, the disc, the digital trail, the DNA. With each revelation, his posture changed slightly. He leaned back, then forward. His calm never fully disappeared, but the confidence that once filled his words began to crack. When asked if he knew why he was there, he answered quietly, yes. What followed was not a dramatic outburst or a breakdown. It was a confession delivered with disturbing clarity. He spoke about his crimes as if listing tasks completed long ago. Dates, locations, methods. He corrected officers when they made small mistakes. To him, accuracy mattered. He wanted the record to be perfect. The detectives listened, some struggling to hide their reactions. They had spent years chasing a ghost, and now the ghost was sitting across from them, explaining everything. There was no anger in his voice, no regret, only a strange sense of pride. As news of the arrest spread, the city reacted in waves. At first, there was disbelief. Many people had lived their entire lives assuming BTK would never be caught. Others felt relief so intense it was overwhelming. Some cried. Some felt numb. For families of the victims, the emotions were complicated and painful. When the suspect's identity was made public, shock turned into something deeper. People recognized his name. They recognized his face. He was not a stranger. He was someone who had lived among them, worked beside them, spoken politely to neighbors. The idea that this man could also be BTK felt impossible. Neighbors gathered outside his home, staring at the quiet house as if it might explain itself. Reporters lined the street. Cameras flashed. Everyone asked the same question. How could no one have known? The answer was hidden in the double life he had perfected. By day, he was ordinary, responsible, invisible. By night, he was something else entirely. For decades, he had balanced those two worlds without letting them touch. Or so he believed. In court, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The room was filled with families who had waited years for this moment. Some held photographs of loved ones they had lost. Others stared straight ahead, unwilling to look at the man responsible. When he entered the courtroom, there were no dramatic reactions from him. He did not avoid eye contact. He did not show shame. He stood and sat when instructed, following procedure with the same calm obedience he had shown since his arrest. Then came the confessions. One by one, he described his crimes in open court. The details were graphic and precise. He spoke without emotion, as if recounting events from someone else's life. For the families, every word was a wound reopened. Some covered their ears. Some wept quietly. Others stared at him, searching his face for something human, something that might explain how he could do such things. But there was nothing there. The judge listened carefully, the courtroom silent except for the killer's voice. This was not just about punishment. It was about understanding the scale of what had been done. Decades of fear. Lives destroyed. A city changed forever. When the time came for sentencing, the outcome was certain. He would never walk free again. Life in prison. No chance of parole. The words echoed through the courtroom, heavy and final. For the first time since his arrest, something close to disappointment crossed his face. Not fear of prison, but the end of the attention. The end of the game. The story was no longer his to control. As officers led him away, families held onto each other. Justice had been served, but it did not feel like victory. Nothing could undo what had been done. Nothing could bring back those who were lost. Outside the courthouse, the city exhaled. For years, BTK had been a question mark, a presence without form. Now he was a man behind bars, stripped of mystery and power. The fear that once followed every quiet street began to loosen its grip. Still, questions remained. How had he managed to live undetected for so long? How many times had people stood next to him, unaware of who he truly was? How many chances had there been to stop him sooner? Investigators would spend years reviewing the case, looking for missed signs, lessons to be learned. The story of BTK would be studied by experts, used to teach future generations about the dangers of underestimating the ordinary. For the victims' families, life after the trial was different. Some found a sense of closure. Others realized closure was a myth. The pain remained, but it changed shape. At least now, there was an answer. At least now, the killer could no longer hurt anyone else. As for the man once known only as BTK, prison walls closed around him, silent and unyielding. The letters stopped. The voice that had demanded attention for decades was finally quiet. The mask had fallen, revealing not a monster from nightmares, but something far more unsettling. A human being who chose to become one. And in that truth, the city of Wichita was left to rebuild, knowing that evil does not always announce itself with darkness and rage. Sometimes, it wears a friendly face and waits patiently for its moment to be seen. When the courtroom doors finally closed and the echoes of the sentencing faded, Wichita was left alone with its thoughts. For 30 years, the city had lived under the shadow of a name that carried fear wherever it was spoken. Now that name belonged to a man locked behind steel doors, stripped of mystery and power. The question that remained was simple but heavy. What happens after the silence returns? At first, the quiet felt strange. There were no new letters to analyze. No hidden messages to fear. No possibility that another family would be torn apart by the same unseen hand. For many people, that absence was a relief so deep it felt unreal. They slept through the night without waking at every sound. They let their children play outside a little longer. They stopped checking the locks 3 times before bed. But silence does not erase memory. For the families of the victims, the end of the trial marked the beginning of a different kind of struggle. For decades, their lives had been shaped by loss and unanswered questions. They had imagined this moment countless times, believing that justice would somehow bring peace. Yet when the killer was finally sentenced, many discovered that peace did not arrive the way they expected. Some felt a sense of closure, a quiet relief knowing the man who destroyed their families would never hurt anyone again. Others felt empty. The anger that had fueled them for years had nowhere to go. The grief, long held back by the hope of answers, rose to the surface in new and painful ways. They returned home to houses that still held memories of those they had lost. Photographs on walls, empty chairs at dinner tables, holidays that never felt complete. Justice had answered the question of who did it, but it could not answer why. It could not give them back the moments stolen from their lives. Across the city, people talked about BTK differently now. The name that once inspired terror was spoken with less power. He was no longer an invisible force. He was a prisoner, a man who would spend the rest of his life confined to a small space, watched, controlled, forgotten by the world he once demanded attention from. That forgetting mattered. For decades, BTK's greatest weapon had not been his violence alone, but his need to be seen. He wanted headlines. He wanted fame. He wanted control over how his story was told. In prison, that control vanished. Letters were limited. Interviews were denied. His voice grew faint, then nearly silent. Experts studied his case closely, trying to understand how someone so ordinary could live such a double life. They spoke about patterns, warning signs, and missed opportunities. They used his story to teach police officers and investigators across the country, hoping that the mistakes of the past could prevent future horrors. One lesson stood out above all others. Evil does not always look like evil. BTK had hidden behind normal routines, trusted roles, and polite behavior. He proved that monsters do not always announce themselves with violence or rage. Sometimes they wait patiently, blending in, relying on the belief that danger must look dangerous. Wichita took that lesson seriously. Community programs focused on awareness rather than fear. People were encouraged to trust their instincts, to speak up about strange behavior without shame. Police departments invested in technology, training, and communication, determined never to let another case go cold because of limited tools. The city began to heal, slowly and unevenly. Healing did not mean forgetting. Memorials were built. Names were spoken aloud, not as victims of fear, but as people who mattered. Families shared stories of their loved ones, reclaiming them from the shadow of the killer who had tried to define them. For younger generations, BTK became a warning rather than a terror. A story taught in classrooms, discussed in documentaries, remembered not for the power of the killer, but for the strength of a city that endured him. In prison, time moved differently. The man once known as BTK adjusted to a life without choices. Days were measured by routine, by lights turning on and off, by meals delivered through small openings. There was no audience, no city watching, no letters printed on front pages. The attention he had craved was gone. Some guards reported that he spoke less as the years passed. Others said he still tried, in small ways, to remind people of who he was. But the world had moved on. His name no longer commanded fear. It existed as a fact, a chapter closed. That, more than prison itself, was his true punishment. Outside those walls, Wichita continued to change. New buildings rose where old ones had stood. Streets were repaved. Families moved in and out. Life went on, as it always does. Yet beneath the growth was a shared understanding that safety could never be taken for granted. People remembered how easily they had once trusted silence, how long it had taken to realize that quiet could hide danger. That awareness became part of the city's identity, shaping how it protected itself and its people. The story of BTK was retold many times, but over time, the focus shifted. It was no longer about the killer's cleverness or cruelty. It was about the mistakes that allowed him to hide, and the patience and persistence that finally brought him down. Investigators who had worked the case spoke openly about the emotional toll it had taken. The sleepless nights, the frustration of dead ends, the weight of knowing someone was out there, watching, waiting. They spoke not to relive the fear, but to honor the effort that never stopped, even when hope was thin. For them, the arrest was not a victory parade. It was a quiet moment of confirmation that persistence matters, that even the longest shadows can be chased into the light. Families of the victims found their own ways forward. Some became advocates for victims' rights. Others chose privacy, rebuilding their lives away from the spotlight. Each path was different, but all was shaped by the same truth. Survival is not about forgetting what happened. It is about finding a way to live with it. Years later, when people spoke about BTK, it was often in the past tense. He was no longer a threat. He was a lesson about arrogance, about how a killer's greatest weakness can be his own pride. BTK believed he was smarter than everyone else. He believed technology could not touch him. He believed he could step back into the spotlight whenever he wanted and remain untouchable. That belief led to his downfall. One small question, one careless decision, one moment where his need for recognition outweighed his caution. After 30 years of silence, it was not police force or luck that caught him. It was his own voice. And so the story ended not with chaos, but with quiet. Not the fearful silence of locked doors and restless nights, but the calm silence of streets returning to normal, of families gathering without dread, of a city reclaiming its identity from a shadow that had loomed for too long. The BTK killer was finally caught, not because he disappeared, but because he could not stay hidden forever. In the end, the city outlasted him, and Wichita learned that while fear can shape a place, it does not have to define it.